afternoon, everybody. How y'all doing today? Well, I don't know what y'all up to. I haven't been up to much, but I've been studying a little bit this morning. And I got some work to do here in a little bit. I got to fix the dryer. The part just came in, so we got to be able to dry some clothes around here. Everything's been breaking since I got here. So, luckily I know how to fix stuff. I'll be able to fix it. I'll fix the lawnmower, and now I'll fix the dryer, and then I'm going to fix the washer, and then I'm going to fix my car. I'm going to fix everything. Because the Lord will help me fix it. The Lord fixes. When you got a problem, the Lord will fix it. Now He'll give you the ability to fix it. That's what He gives me. And as y'all notice, I might move my head, and the sun's right behind my head. Look at that. So, anyway. Today's lesson. We're in 1 Chronicles, chapter 12. And we're talking about David again. And of course, this focuses on David mostly. And the message is David, the making of a kingdom and the gathering of the king's men. Because this chapter is a detailed account of how David grew his army and the widespread support that he started to receive from all the tribes of Israel. First, while he was a fugitive, at first he, when he was first beginning, he had, Saul was after him, Saul's men was after him. He was a fugitive to begin with, and so he had this support among these men when he was first in this situation. And then later on, as he was coronated as king, and he started to build his kingdom, the support from these same men were what helped solidify support, so that he could grow his might. That even though Saul was dead, there were still people that were loyal to Saul, and that they was going to have to fight to secure the kingdom. And so this chapter pretty much highlights this unity and loyalty, and this divine how his his role was divinely sanctioned. This rise of David was divinely sanctioned by God. His rise to power, and so it highlights that his role as God's appointed king. This chapter is divided into two main sections, and the first section, one section details the men who joined David at Ziklag, the stronghold, and those who assembled at Hebron for his coronation. And so the first part were these warriors that joined David while he was in hiding. And it documents the initial, voluntary and often risky commitment of these soldiers to David while he was a fugitive from King Saul. But this showed that God's favor was already on David at this point, even before Saul, was killed, before Saul died, and his reign was over with. Then, David was already being blessed by God, and his favor was already shining on him. That these men were risking their lives to follow him, because they believed in this divine sanctioning of David as king, that he would be king. This was part of their faith. They were being driven by their own faith in God, that they should be back in David. Um, then in and especially telling is the part that were these Benjamites that were they were warriors from Saul's own tribe that and they were described as expert archers and slingers. Um, that they joined David. Um, this highlighted, their loyalty despite this kinship that they had with Saul. Um, but it was a risky uh, thing to do to go follow David over Saul for their own tribe. But they were putting God before kinship in this effort, and they're taking the risk on God, on behalf of God. Their faith made them take the risk. And it also highlights, the Gadites, which were at the stronghold. Uh, they were considered fierce, swift. It says warriors, and they crossed the Jordan when it was overflowing. The Jordan River. It says it was overflowing. It was flooded. It had swelled and it was flooded, and they took this risk against the natural elements to join David. Um, so this was a courageous, this showed their valor, and this was a courageous thing to do. That they braved these flood waters to be able to join David, because again, their faith their faith uh, was greater than the natural elements that they knew that they needed to join David and follow his cause. They were led by God to do so. Um, and then in uh, verse 16 and 18, we see where these um, David kind of tests their loyalty, and the spirit comes over this one. These were the Benjamites and the Judites at the stronghold, and then the Holy Spirit come over. The Spirit of the Lord came over this one man named Massa, and uh, he tells how God has blessed David. Let me find it right here real quick, because I want to read that real quick. Where it says that David pretty much told them in verse 7, starting in verse 16, it says, "And David went out to meet them, and answered and said unto them, If ye be come peaceably unto me to help me, mine heart shall be knit unto you. But if you come to betray me to mine enemies, seeing there is no wrong in my hands, the God of our fathers look thereon and rebuke it." And then the Spirit came upon Amasa, who was chief of the captains, and he said, Thine are we, David, and on thy side be unto thee, and peace be to thine helpers, for thy God helpeth thee. Then David received them and made them captains of the band. So David was pretty much saying, are you for me, or are you against me? If you're for me, I'll receive you. If you're not for me, God rebuke you. And Amasa, the Spirit speaks through Amasa and says, "We are for you, David." Um, and David gladly receives them. So this was affirmation of God's blessing on David. And this showed, the discernment, the spiritual discernment of the Spirit that fell upon Amasa, that showed him that David was this divinely sanctioned king, that and that God was with him, and so therefore they they should be with him too. And then it talks about the Massonites at Ziklag who had defected from the Philistine army. They were defectors from the Philistines, and they also joined David and helped him against these raiding bands uh, of Philistines. And it talks about how the army grew uh, at this point, saying that they were like the army of God. They this army grew so greatly. It was it could only be that God was growing this army. This was the army of God. They were assured that this growth uh, showed this divine favor. That this had to be God's army because of the way it was growing. And then the second part of the chapter shows uh, it fast forwards to after this was during this time where before David was crowned king, and now the second part fast forwards to the moment that David is actually appointed king over all of Israel, uh, uh, showing this vast, unified, and enthusiastic gathering of all these military forces from every tribe that come to actually the coronation and appointment of David as king. And he gives this list of these tribal contingents, a detailed roster of the numerous well-equipped soldiers from all the tribes: Judah, Simeon, Levi, Benjamin, Ephraim, Manasseh, Issachar, Zebulun, all the tribes who came to Hebron. And the sheer scope of the list shows this unity of all Israel. It shows how many, all these tribes came together. That Israel was all united to see David crowned king. And it goes on to specifically note the men of Issachar that were understanding of the times to know that this was what Israel ought to do. This showed their wisdom, and this divine wisdom and discernment that was uh, required for faithful service that was on these men specifically. And then at the end of the chapter, it highlights this coronation feast. They had, and all the men came. It says with a loyal heart. They all came with this heart for David, this heart that this is God's appointed king, and that we are behind him 100%. And they're gathering these forces, this military might, these king's men are gathering to have this feast, this celebration of their new king, and to make David their new king. And so it says that they celebrated with great joy and feasting for 3 days. They had a party for 3 days. This is how much joy they had in that they were appointing David as their new king, and that God was behind this. They had this wholehearted commitment and this joy for their new divinely appointed King David. And so this chapter within the biblical narrative emphasizes the unanimous and divinely orchestrated support for God's chosen king, with David. And it shows this transition of the kingdom from Saul to David. It wasn't just political or a political shift. But it was this convergence of all Israel unified in this wholehearted commitment to God's anointed leader. And it serves as this very rich foreshadowing of of Jesus, who would be the greater son than David. Um, just as all these diversified people, they were highly skilled people. They all had their talents and their skills. That's detailed as it tells the men, different men, how they were mighty warriors, but some were archers and some were slingers and some just had wisdom and discernment. All these different mighty men, they had their own skill sets that were called, they're even these outcasts. They're even the people that were outcasts that were rallied behind David. So not only the skilled, but also the outcasts that came and rallied behind David, the rightful king. And just like how the gospel calls people from every tribe, every language, and people and nation uh, to pledge their allegiance to Christ, uh, who is the King of Kings and the one true King and the final King. And these men who joined David weren't necessarily these, uh, you know, the social elite. Like I said, some of them were outcasts. And they were military men. These were like the working class. You know, these weren't royalty that were following David. These were haggard men of battle and the marginalized and the rejected, like Jesus called to himself. And that highlights a very important concept, or of the gospel, especially when it comes to the first being the last and the last being the first. And so, and the theme of the least of these. This chapter also offers these themes for the spiritual life and our spiritual growth. Um, One is, wholehearted commitment that we have to have a loyal heart to God, and in following Christ, we have to be loyal to Christ. Uh, you know, True discipleship requires total dedication, total commitment, 100%. You know, that it reminds me of the rich man who came to Jesus and said, "What must I do?" And Jesus said, "Give everything away and follow me." And the rich man said, he couldn't do it. He went away sad because he had many possessions. He couldn't give up. He couldn't give everything up to follow the Lord. That's what's required. You have to be willing. If he asks whatever he asks for you to give up, you got to be willing to give it up to follow. That's total dedication. That's 100%. That's what submission means. Submitting to his will over our own. So this also highlights how important it is that we discern the times. These men of Issachar, it says they understood the times and to know what Israel ought to do. Spiritual growth requires believers to be able to discern the times over present age and understand what God's will is for it now, and to be able to act decisively for the kingdom and for the future. What is required now to 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 create that, um, to help build it, and help create a future for the kingdom. We don't know, we can't know the future, but we can discern what we must do now to ensure the future promises, what God has, the mission that God has entrusted us with. We can be able to discern the steps that we should be taking now in this present age to ensure that that mission continues into the future. And it also highlights this unity in diversity. This gathering of all the 12 tribes to David uh, is prefigures it's a it symbolizes how there's supposed to be this unity of the church. It's like a foreshadowing of the unity of the church in Christ, where believers from all backgrounds serve the same King. And uh, this demonstrates the power of, you know, unified purpose. The church with a unified purpose can become a very powerful, mighty thing. This army of God, just like these men became that was gathered to David. And a little, side note to this is overall, as an overall theme of this chapter, what it highlights is this providence, especially early on with David, before Saul was ever even, before the death of Saul, and David was a fugitive, and how God was with him, and and God's favor was upon him, uh, and showing that this he came from that being a fugitive to amassing into this great, it says, great army, like the army of God in verse 22. It shows how God's hand was orchestrating this whole entire thing. That cannot happen without God's hand being on it. And so, that, as I said, this shows God's providence, and that God's hand was guiding this effort. So that's that is the mission that we all have now today as believers is to is this great gathering, this building, this creating this church, this that has this unified purpose for Christ to become this bride that He will come for. Um, which can which is something that is um, severely hindered by disunity and division, and not being on the same page. These men from all these 12 tribes were on the same page. David is king. And today the church, all these different denominations and sects, and we got to get on the same page. That's just the way it is. And I'm sure that, as I said, they all had their own skill sets. They had all of them had their different ways of doing things. They had their cultures that they had been brought up in within these different tribes. But I'm sure they put a lot aside for this commitment, this wholehearted commitment, that David was this chosen king, and that they were going to see that David became king, and that they helped him establish his purposes. That it was because this was God's appointed purposes, and they were able to come together and have this great celebration and this great joy in doing so, in making sure this was established. And that's something that's needed today. Something we all need to pray for. So, anyway, I guess that's it for today. I'm going to get off here. I got some work to do. And I will see y'all back here tomorrow. I love y'all.